In those days, the IOCs also were integrated. They owned the fields, and because they owned the fields, there was some logic to owning the whole stream, right? Even if parts of it didn't make a profit, there was some logic to it. But it rested on these concessions. Now, there was no market. I mean, there was a little spot market to trade some oil, but there's literally no market. So how do you get rid of the historic volatility in the oil markets, or any other commodity that's based on rents, agriculture? One way, strategy that, the capitalist system evolved in those days was almost get rid of the markets, right? It's handled internally, etc. Well, as we know, the OPEC revolution changed this. 77% of the world's oil is now owned by OPEC countries and is not simply available for equity equity shareholdings by those big oil companies. And some of this as well. It's a mixed bag. So nowadays, there's a situation where the bilateral, mercantilist, neocolonial, all these various aspects are really kind of wiped out. And what we have is we're back to a market with all the problems of a market. Volatility, question of how do you guarantee security of supply now, okay? And also we have another outstanding feature is that there's no real energy independence for any major consuming country. Nobody can get enough oil, what they need for their imports, from any one or two countries alone. It just doesn't, you got to go to the barrel. And the thing about the barrel is, if somebody doesn't put their oil in because of an earthquake, a revolution, the level goes down and it affects everybody equally. Well, the first order, right? The price goes up. In theory, people will want to produce more oil, but it's a sort of collective, it's a sort of automatic, the first order collective security system in that way. So, what are the aspects of this one global barrel security system? It's a sort of collective, especially OECD dependent. There's a security for OPEC too, but I'm not dealing with that here. There's the market itself, as I just explained. Okay, of course, there's no need anymore. There's not the same motivation to have integration. All these people go back and forth to the market as well once there is nationalization. Well, historically what's happened is if the barrel starts going down too fast, Saudi Arabia always had excess production. That was a problem in recent years when the price was so high, they only had maybe 2 million barrels, and that was really on sort of the hairy edge, and that had to do a lot with the speculation that took off, right? Another one is something that was pretty much, I would say, Henry Kissinger is responsible for, is the strategic petroleum reserves of the International Energy Agency, which is an agency of the OECD countries. And there's over 4 billion barrels, basically, between commercial and government stocks available in a crisis. And actually, that's what took care of the United States during Katrina, for example, right? So we have all these things. There's the market itself, Saudi spare capacity, the strategic reserves, and there is this trend, especially since 1986 and the Saudi netback crisis, of IEA, OPEC collaboration, all sorts of things. There's the International Energy Forum, the so-called producer-consumer dialogue. There's a history of having set price bands at different times, and there's this, basically the Saudis took care of things in the last two Gulf Wars. Don't worry, don't call on the reserves. We can produce enough oil. You'll crash the price of oil if you release those reserves. And there's this confidence building that took place over time. But now we know what, in the neo-colonial period, what the power projection stuff was like. We had gunboat diplomacy, and sort of at the end of that era, you had, when Britain was going to become a basket case if they lost Iran, their exchequer, they were very concerned in getting it back. That has a lot of this sort of neo-colonial aspect to it. But the Iraq War, for example, and the current Iran crisis is quite different insofar as it affects oil. So what are these constraints? There are still power projection aspects. Well, there's a bit of a problem in this system, this global barrel system, and that is that, now this data I put up here because it was the colorful one, is like from 2005 or 6. I could show you 2010, it's almost exact. This number is from 2010. It was a few percentage higher then. Especially for light oil, something like 60% of the world's light oil is concentrated in about 5 countries around a very small, relatively small body of water, right? So there's this issue of concentration that, of course, can cause a problem in a market-centered system. This is reserves. If I showed you, I don't have time, but if I showed you production, the U.S. is producing like crazy based on small reserves. So are the Russians. So are most of the northern hemisphere people, which means over time this market share will inevitably grow. This indicates heavy oil. This is all heavy oil in Canada. It's nowhere near as economical to develop. And this is what probably Venezuela will add, something like that with their heavy oil. But that's something else. So this oil, too, is extremely cheap. This was the best data a Senate committee could obtain in 2006, roughly what it cost per barrel to get this out of the ground. And there's the Persian Gulf, and there's Iran and Iraq. It's the cheapest oil in the world to get out of the ground. And here's that heavy oil, which is something else. If we take the rate at which, a few years ago, these countries were producing oil, or these regions and countries were producing oil, and divide that into the amount of proven reserves they have, we get something called the RP ratio, which comes out in time, in years. So at that rate, how long could you continue to produce? Now, of course, the rate of production will change and people will find more oil and stuff. But it's, to first order, it's a good comparison to make. Well, here's Iran and Iraq. Anyone who says the Persian Gulf isn't going to be important in the future should look at this. The blue ones are the Persian Gulf, all right? I mean, I have to say, if heavy oil becomes economical and gets developed, you know, that'll be up there too. But that's sort of farther out. So, here's this collective OECD security system. How is this going to be taken into account, this concentration of oil, historically? Well, what kind of problems can happen? What if one of these 5 countries projects power and, well, it was this way. What if one of these projects power and takes over the other one? Is there a market anymore? Well, if you combine those and run it across, you see those 2 countries together have well over twice as much oil, basically, as any other continent, especially if you don't count the heavy oil. That one thing I think Henry Greenspan was right about, here's also Iran all by itself with the proven reserves. And Iran, some people say the geology is, 30 years back because, the exploration hasn't taken place there like in some other places. So who knows what's there. And Iraq, we're learning more about that now. But, it's more than any other continent taken by itself, really, as far as light oil. So what Greenspan said to Mr. Woodward, and I'm just quoting him I would say this sort of myself, this idea that the U.S., various people had this idea, both on the right and on the left. You remember there's a lot of talk about imperialism in those days, that this was just a reversion to neocolonialism. The U.S. is going to grab oil. Well, that's inconsistent with the present system. No. He said he was not implying. Well, he says somewhere else that the market would now be Hussein's plaything to control that much oil at once. And he objects. He says to Woodward, he was not implying that the war was an oil grab. No, he said. So in other words, not the American companies grabbing oil or something like that, or the British. Getting rid of Hussein achieved the purpose of making certain that the existing system, Woodward added this, of oil markets, that's what they were talking about, continues to work. Right? So there's a different motivation for things now than in the past.